Hello, veterans, and welcome back to C4. Again, I'm your host. My name is Rick Seaman, and today the subject is PTSD. With me today are two experts on the subject. To my right, to your left, is Shad Meshad. Shad is the founder of the Vet Center programs for the VA. Shad is also the founder of the National Veterans Foundation. And Shad has been working with PTSD since the word began, I would say. Also, on my left, on your right, I have Dr. Bridget Cantrell. She is a counselor and therapist from Washington State, and she's down here in our area this month. She's on a workshop tour with the military.
That's correct, yes.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Great to have you folks here. As I like to do in most cases, I like to give us a little background on our subjects. PTSD. Shad, you were around when the word was invented, or if that's a proper term.
Well, I was one of the pioneers. There were several of us, but we didn't know it as PTSD. We knew it was different. It wasn't schizophrenia. It wasn't psychosis. It wasn't character disorder or personality disorder. We knew that there were changes that occurred in life-death situations, which are in combat. And there were many of us giving it different names in the early 70s. Actually, in 1970, Dr. Shad gave it the name post-Vietnam syndrome. Actually, it wasn't a syndrome, but he was using that sort of as a figure of speech of saying it's different than this or that. And so from that, for many years, everybody says, do you have PVS? Post-Vietnam syndrome. That was the big word all through the 70s. It was like, well, what is syndrome? Syndrome, I mean, it really has no meaning. It's just sort of a generic concept that there's there's something interactive, there's something that's here. And so many of us, from Dr. Robert Lifton, Haim Shatten, particularly Dr. Charles Figley, who also was a combat Marine vet in the mid-60s who came back and whatever, and he did his research and started looking over the 20th century, from World War I. There was a lot of history written there, and obviously World War II and Korea and in Vietnam, and said that this is sort of a delayed stress reaction. It's, we sort of freeze dry trauma, because if you're ever in a catastrophic event, you usually, just try to get through it. You don't sit and think about it, because usually they happen pretty fast. Usually, not all the times. And so the brain has this function where it just sort of freezes everything and just survives whatever's going on. It's later, when the person is finally away from danger, that things start happening. There's sort of this meltdown, and all of a sudden these stress reactions, weird behavior occurs when there's really nothing catastrophic happening. We called it delayed stress. In fact, the first book was written by Figley in 78 called Delayed Stress Reactions Amongst Vietnam Veterans. And that was a very significant book. Yeah. And because of the time Jimmy Carter was in, and he was very sensitive to a lot of the work, including mine, in the VA at the time. And with the fact that, Alan Cranston had been pushing so hard for a Vietnam vet readjustment bill, but no one knew what's readjustment, what's syndrome. And I had this program in Los Angeles in the Vietnam Veterans Resocialization Unit, and I was dealing with this post-Vietnam syndrome, running my rap groups, dealing with it, just didn't have a definition, couldn't file a claim for it. Right. I just knew my guys weren't crazy, as we know crazy. They're character disorders, just, in layman's terms, just people that can't get along with anybody,
Right.
So people started coming together. We kept going to the APAs, and we kept presenting this delayed stress. From 78, 79, 80, by the time that the diagnostic group, the people that decide what goes into the psychiatric textbook, finally came up with the name, which today everybody knows, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Right. And it's been revised several times since, and that's really sort of the origin of it. And it's been a great thing. Doesn't mean that it didn't exist. The definition, defining it in a psychiatric textbook, was not available to us.
Right. Bridget, what was your introduction to PTSD?
Well, I grew up in a household with a father who was a World War II Korean War combat veteran. So I knew early on as a child that things were quite challenging in my household. And then when I was in graduate school in the 90s, I did a practicum at the Palo Alto VA. And I was in a program that lost its funding, and I saw how devastating that was to the veterans who were participating in that program. And so that spurred me to change my dissertation topic and do my dissertation on Vietnam veterans and social support and PTSD. And so ever since then, my whole life has just been working with veterans and their families since the 90s.
Great. World War II. We produced more combat veterans coming out of any war in World War II. Many of them have passed on. Some are in their 80s today, in their 90s. Where are they on the charts?
Well, actually, they're not on the charts. They could be on the charts.
Yeah.
They definitely are eligible to apply for PTSD. But, you know, I think a lot of things. But obviously, if I was a World War II vet and the fact that all this developed out of the Vietnam era and the fact that most of my life, major part of my life is past, and wherever I am going back or saying, hey, I had this or whatever, or shell shock or whatever you want to call it, it's not going to make a real difference unless something happens where this person gets isolated and starts deteriorating, and all of a sudden he gets into the VA system. And when he opens up, like they did, if you remember, when Saving Private Ryan, remember the foundation got funding from DreamWorks because they were worried about these World War II vets seeing this real film, and sure enough, our hotline went from all Vietnam vets to about 3 months of nothing but World War II vets calling, going, I have that, yeah. I felt that.
Yeah.
All of a sudden it was like, I didn't know this, and you know, they just were a very silent, strong group generation. And we saw it very clearly that it definitely existed. It was like, whoa.
I remember that.
So historically, you know, World War II vets just have lived and endured, and what you know, what you don't know won't hurt you. So now they know. It's like, golly, that would have been a lot easier if I could have went to a vet center or a workshop or whatever. Maybe I wouldn't have been married 3 times or suffered alcoholism or smoked myself to death or so forth.
We're going to take a break, and we will be right back with C4 on PTSD.